Hello, class, and welcome to this week in our exploration of the brain and human behavior. Within this week's lectures, we'll take a look at motor control systems as well as language. In this particular lecture, this part of the lecture, we'll look at motor control and its essential parts and why it's so important within our daily lives. It's something that we do when we wake up and stretch our arms. It's something that we use when we walk to the bathroom. It's something that we do when we type in the computer. It is an essential part of every moment of our day. And so it not only has implications in medicine and sports and rehabilitation, but it has implications for your very existence. So as we examine the key brain regions and neural networks responsible for motor control, I hope that you appreciate just how vast the systems are that go into every moment that you are texting on your phone. So let's dive into what we'll be covering in this lecture as we look at the biology of motor control within the brain. And so we're going to start off with a story, as we always do. I like to have a little story that helps you appreciate the history of how we came to learn what we know about this system. We'll then delve into introducing you to the motor cortex, that very pivotal brain region responsible for orchestrating our voluntary movement. And understanding the motor cortex is really kind of essential for appreciating how we control our movement. It's the epicenter, essentially, of motor control on the brain. And then we'll narrow in on two specific regions within that motor cortex, something known as Area 4 and Area 6. We'll then look a little bit at the cellular organization of the motor system. Remember, that's called cytoarchitecture. And then we'll delve into the role of the basal ganglia, which is really a very complex structure made up of small little nuclei within the brain that play vital roles for modulating and fine-tuning motor functions. And we'll wrap up our lecture by taking a look at the role of the cerebellum and the pons, both of which are very essential in the overall coordination and function of motor learning. So, as we begin, I'd like to start off with that little story having to do with the life and legacy of Sir Charles Scott Sherrington. Now, Sir Charles Scott Sherrington was an English neurophysiologist born in 1857, and he really made a monumental contribution to our understanding of the motor control system within the nervous system. He was not only someone that advanced the field of neuroscience, but he really impacted the broader fields of physiology and our understanding of basic human behavior. And that's a lot to say for someone that focused on reflexes. But he found that the reflex arc, that whole idea, he's the one that kind of came up with the concept of the reflex arc, which is a fundamental neural circuit that underlies many of our motor responses. And so he conducted some groundbreaking research that revealed the intricacies of how sensory input and motor output in the nervous system are all interconnected. And so some of Sherrington's studies on spinal reflexes, we're going to call these, and we know these as the knee-jerk reflex, were pivotal in demonstrating the principles of neural communication and coordination. And interestingly, Sherrington is the one that coined that term, synapse, and he used that to describe the junction where nerve cells communicate. So Sherrington has obviously done a lot for our understanding of the nervous system as a whole, but specifically in how synaptic transmission laid the groundwork for our understanding of control of the motor responses. And some of Sherrington's observations on motor coordination and its concept of something that is called muscle sense highlights the importance of a term that we call now proprioception, which is basically our awareness of one's body position and its movement within motor control. So his research really emphasized the role of sensory feedback in refining and regulating our motor actions, which is a concept that continues to be central in our understanding of motor control today. And really, as we look through this lecture, I want you to kind of keep in mind just how intricate that sensory feedback and that refining system and regulation of the motor actions within our bodies, and that as it moves through our brain, has so many different layers. It isn't something that just originates in one spot and results in motor control. It goes through many, many layers of systems. And so Sherrington's scientific legacy is vast, and rightly he was granted a Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine for his work in the nervous system, including motor control. And so he remains a foundational figure in the study of neuroscience, particularly when it has to do with the motor system. So let's delve into what the motor system looks like. And we're going to start with the top of our head. Naturally, the motor cortex is a region of our cerebral cortex, that outermost layer of the brain, and it plays a pivotal role in our planning and initiation and execution of voluntary movements. And so this region serves as the command center for our motor actions, allowing us to perform a wide range of complex tasks, from using our thumbs to text out a message, to typing on a keyboard, to throwing a baseball. And so it's something that's located in that posterior part of our frontal lobe. So the motor cortex, you can kind of think of it being divided into two primary areas. You have the area 4, which is the primary motor cortex, and area 6, which is the premotor cortex. And each of these areas has their own distinct functions and contributes to the overall ability of motor movements. Now, as far as the broad picture goes, the motor cortex is really responsible for the execution of motor commands and is responsible for sending signals to the muscles that generate our voluntary movements. It also is involved in the organization of these complex motor tasks and the sequencing of actions and the timing of movements. So the thing, though, to keep in mind is that there are these sub-areas which we'll take a look at shortly, but the motor cortex itself doesn't operate in isolation. It's closely connected to other regions of the brain, including our sensory cortex, which it's obviously lies right up against in the parietal lobe. It's also very closely linked with the basal ganglia below it, and the cerebellum and brainstem farther below and to the back yet even more. And these connections enable the motor cortex to receive sensory information and to do some fine-tuning adjustments in real time, allowing for precise and adaptive movements. So, in this part now, we'll take a look at the two critical sub-areas of the motor cortex. And we'll call these Area 4, which, if you recall, is the primary motor cortex, and Area 6, which is the premotor cortex. So, understanding the roles of these regions will provide us with essential insights into how the brain orchestrates its movements. So with Area 4, that primary motor cortex, sometimes we call this M1 because it's the primary area of the motor cortex. This region is located in that posterior part of the frontal lobe, and you can kind of think of this as being the real executive area of the motor cortex. It is responsible for the initiating and executing of voluntary movements. And when you decide to move your hands, for instance, the precise commands that specify the direction and force and sequence of muscle contractions are generated in this area 4. And the primary motor cortex is known for its somatotopic organization, meaning that different body parts are represented in distinct areas of this region. So this forms what we commonly refer to as the motor homunculus. If you recall what the sensory homunculus was, this is kind of the motor equivalent to that. Then there's area 6, which is the premotor cortex. And this is situated just anterior to the primary motor cortex. And area 6 plays a crucial role in planning and organizing movements. And unlike the primary motor cortex, which is primarily involved in the execution of movements, the premotor cortex is more focused on the preparation and coordination of actions. So it integrates sensory information such as proprioception and vision to select and refine the motor plans. And this region is essential for tasks that require complex sequences of actions and precise timing and adaptability. And it's together that these two regions work in concert, with the premotor cortex providing the planning and organization needed for precise movements, and the primary motor cortex giving the execution of commands for movements with the necessary precision. So, right off the bat, even in the motor cortex, there are different parts working together. And of course, with every system, there is its own unique arrangement and type of neurons and nerve cells that help to maximize the efficiency of that system. Different brain regions have unique cytoarchitectural characteristics, and these differences are closely linked to their specific function. And in the context of motor control, the motor cortex and related brain areas exhibit this distinct architectural feature. To start off with, it's layered in the motor cortex. Particularly, we see this in the area 4 region, but also, of course, in the area 6, premotor cortex. And this layering within the cortex is characterized by a 6-layer structure, and each layer contains different types of neurons and serves specific functions. For example, layer 5 of the primary motor cortex contains large pyramidal neurons that send motor commands to the spinal cord, initiating muscle contractions. Now, what are these pyramidal systems? We call these BET cells, and they are giant pyramidal neurons that are located in that 5th layer of the gray matter in the primary motor cortex. And these are the principal neurons of the motor cortex. So we can think of the motor system as being a pyramidal system. And so the pyramidal neurons are named, naturally, for this because they are triangular shaped and are responsible for sending signals from the cortex to other parts of the brain and the spinal cord. And so they play a very crucial role in the execution of voluntary movement. Now, the cytoarchitecture in the motor system is not just the pyramidal or BET cells. There's also, of course, interneurons, because the motor cortex needs these various types of interneurons to play a critical role in the local processing and communication within the cortex, because this helps to create that fine-tuned motor commands and integrate the sensory information to ensure that movements are precise and coordinated. And of course, I've already mentioned the somatotopic organization within the motor cortex. This means that the different body parts are represented in specific regions of the motor cortex. So, for example, the area of the motor cortex responsible for controlling hand movement is distinct from the area responsible for leg movement. And these overall organizations really reflect the brain's precise control over different body parts. So it's important to be mindful of this importance of the cytoarchitecture of the motor system within the brain, particularly to remember that the motor system is a pyramidal system. That is, it's largely made up of those pyramidal Betz cells, those pyramidal neurons. Then, of course, there is the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia is really a complex group of nuclei deep within the brain that have their own small little specific functions. So I want to kind of explore some of these because there's a lot of important parts here. These include things like the striatum, the globus pallidus, the subthalamic nucleus, and the substantia nigra, which literally means the black stuff. And all of these play roles in the intricate structure of the brain, and these are located in the forebrain, and they're responsible for a wide range of functions, with motor control being one of their primary domains. For example, movement and initiation and the suppression of other movements. That's something that the basal ganglia plays a crucial role in. It plays a crucial role in initiating and modulating movements, and it helps in selecting specific motor programs while inhibiting the unwanted or inappropriate actions. So these functions allow us to execute precise and purposeful movements while preventing interference from competing motor commands. So when something here like this goes wrong, so you can think of Michael J. Fox and his struggle with Parkinson's, that is largely damage to the basal ganglia, probably to the substantia nigra specifically. And you see there's some jerking movements, and basically there's a disruption of the function of the basal ganglia to prevent the interference from competing motor commands. There's also something that the basal ganglia does in motor learning and skill acquisition. So beyond the basic movement control, the basal ganglia is involved in motor learning and skill acquisition. Now, it's not a primary player in that, but it is a player. And so it plays a part in adapting and refining the motor patterns through practice and repetition. So it contributes to our ability to acquire new skills, such as playing a musical instrument or perfecting a sports technique. It's also important in muscle tone. So the basal ganglia helps regulate muscle tone and ensures that our muscles maintain an appropriate level of tension for smooth and coordinated movements. And so dysfunction in this aspect can lead to movement disorders such as that are characterized by things like rigidity or involuntary muscle contractions. And it also plays a role in cognitive and emotional aspects of movement. So while primarily associated with the motor control system, the basal ganglia also interacts with cognitive and emotional processes. And this influences things like motivation and reward and decision-making related to our actions and our movements. And so when you have this dysfunction in the basal ganglia, it can result in a wide range of movement disorders. And I've already mentioned Parkinson's disease or something like Huntington's disease. And so understanding the role of the basal ganglia in motor control is really essential for unraveling the underlying mechanisms of these conditions. And, of course, of developing some effective treatments for them. Then let's move down and farther back yet more and explore two critical structures involved in fine-tuning and coordinating our movements, namely the cerebellum and the pons. Now, the cerebellum, if you recall, is that cauliflower structure at the bottom of the back of our brain. We literally call this the little brain. That's what cerebellum means. And it is that distinct structure located at the base of the brain, just behind the brainstem. And despite, though, its relatively small size, the cerebellum plays a major role in motor control and coordination. So its function can be summarized as managing the fine motor coordination. So the cerebellum is responsible for the precise coordination of movements, ensuring that they are smooth and accurate and well-timed. And this is essential for basic tasks like handwriting or playing a musical instrument or just simply maintaining balance. It's also essential for motor learning, so it plays a very key role in our muscle memory of learning and adapting our movements based on sensory feedback. So through a process that we know as motor adaptation, the cerebellum helps us refine our motor skills over time. And of course, the cerebellum contributes significantly to maintaining our posture, maintaining proper posture, and maintaining our balance. And so it receives input from sensory systems such as the inner ear and helps adjust muscle tone to keep us steady on our feet. And it also plays a critical role in timing of motor control. And so it helps to regulate the timing of movement. And this is important for precise activities like, anything from dancing to catching a baseball would be part of that. And then, of course, there's the bridge, the pons. The pons is that region located in the brainstem, specifically that upper part of the hindbrain. And it serves as a bridge connecting various parts of the brain, including the cerebellum, with the spinal cord. And the pons plays several roles in motor control. One thing that it does is it relays signals between the cerebellum and other parts of the brain, including the motor cortex. And this communication obviously is essential in coordinating voluntary movement. Now, one way you can kind of think of it is the command comes down from the motor cortex, it goes through the pons, it's given to the cerebellum. The cerebellum does all the complex communications and then gives us a more simplified answer to the pons that can then distribute it around to where it needs to go. The pons is also essential in aspects of respiration, including our heart breathing rate. Sorry, not our heart, but our breathing rate and the depth of the breathing that's appropriate for different activities. If we're doing something that's really physically exerted, the pons will tell our body to prepare for that by breathing more deeply. And then, of course, in sleep regulation, it also plays a role in regulating our sleep and wakefulness. And so it's something that's, while this is just indirectly affects our motor function, it nevertheless has something to do with our alertness and our energy levels. So that, I think, is important. So overall, I hope you see that there's a lot of coordination that needs to go on in the motor system, from our motor cortex through to the basal ganglia, through to the pons and the cerebellum. There's a lot going on just within the brain before something ever gets into the rest of our body as far as commands go. Now, let's just review some basic terms. We have our motor cortex. What is that? That is that region of the cerebral cortex responsible for planning and initiating and executing voluntary movements. Of course, there are those two primary parts of the motor cortex. We have our area 4 part, which is the primary motor cortex. Remember, that is the part of the cortex responsible for the execution of motor commands and is known for its somatotropic organization. And then we have our area 6, which is our premotor cortex. And that's the region of the motor cortex involved in the planning and overall coordination of movements, including integrating some sensory information. Then there's, of course, the basal ganglia, which is that complex group of nuclei in the forebrain that plays a central role in initiating and modulating movements and motor learning and more. And, of course, the cerebellum, that little brain located at the base of the brain, responsible for fine motor coordination and motor learning and balance and timing. And, of course, when you mention the cerebellum, you always need to think of the pons, which is literally the bridge between the cerebellum and the rest of the parts of the brain and its roles. So overall, what did we learn in this part of our lecture? Well, we learned that Sir Charles Scott Sherrington was a pioneer that worked on the reflex arc and the synaptic transmission and the whole idea of muscle sense and proprioception. We looked at the motor cortex, that central region of motor control, and we discussed the primary areas of Area 4, the primary motor cortex, and Area 6, the premotor cortex. We explored cytoarchitecture, that cellular organization of the motor system, and we learned about the Betz cells and the pyramidal system. We explored the basal ganglia and delved into the role of the basal ganglia in initiating and modulating and fine-tuning movements, as well as its contribution to motor learning. We also looked at the cerebellum and the pons, and we examined the cerebellum's role in fine motor control and, of course, in motor learning and balance and timing, as well as the pons function in relaying signals and regulating respiration. So overall, I hope you really learned a lot here in the biology of motor control within the brain, and I hope that you recognize that it sheds light on the remarkable complexity and precision with which our brains orchestrate our movements. So we've learned about the historical contributions, the importance of specific regions like the motor cortex, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the pons, and the cellular organization that underlies motor control. And I hope that you appreciate just how much your brain has to work to send that simple text on your phone. Hope you enjoyed this part of our lecture, and I'll see you in just a few minutes as you come back to complete the second part of this lecture. You take care. Goodbye.